Right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining the Nature Action 100 webinar for the release of our first company benchmark. I'm Carolyn Ching, and I'm going to take a moment to allow participants to join the webinar. So thank you for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Nature Action 100 company benchmark. Today, we are introducing the results of our first benchmark. Thank you for joining. So I'm Carolyn, I'm director on the Food and Forest team here at Ceres. Ceres and IGCC together are run the secretariat for the Nature Action 100 benchmark. So today we are sharing the results of that. So as you joined, you may have heard that this session is being recorded, and we are able to provide a copy of the recording, a link to the recording for all participants that actually for all registrants of the webinar. So you will be receiving that shortly after its completion. We do have time later on for questions and answers. So if you have questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the of your screen, and you can type in your question there. And then also, if you need closed captioning, you can select that option in the Zoom toolbar. So on the next slide, we have our disclaimer. So I just want to make clear that Nature Action 100 is an investor engagement initiative, and it does not require or seek collective information, decision-making, or action. And investor participants are independent fiduciaries. They are responsible for their own investment and voting decisions, and the initiative and its partners do not act or speak on behalf of each other or the investor participants. On the next slide, please. So I am doing this webinar today from Seattle, Washington, and this is the land of the Duwamish, the Suquamish, and the Coast Salish people. And before we get into the details of the content of our webinar, I do want to respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Native and Indigenous people in the US and globally that have stewarded our lands for generations, and they pay attention to both people and the environment. We make this land acknowledgement because we need to reaffirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, and including through our work, which we will touch on a little bit later today. Next slide. So today I'm joined by two of my colleagues within Nature Action 100. Sam Cornish, he is the Transition Research Specialist at IIGCC, and he supports investors with assessing the quality of corporate transition plans. Graham Hamley is a senior manager on the Ceres Food and Forest team, and he focuses on nature-related issues. Together, Sam and Graham have been critical to supporting the development of the Nature Action 100 benchmark methodology, as well as the assessments. We are also joined by Beth Gallagher, who is the Director of Engagement at Domini Impact Investment, and Peter van der Werf, who is the Head of Active Ownership at Robeco. I will give a more detailed introduction of Beth and Peter when we have them join us on screen today. On the next slide is our agenda for today. So we are going to provide you with an introduction to Nature Action 100, and that will be followed by some of the key findings from our newly released benchmark assessments. And then we'll have a panel discussion with Beth and Peter, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Sam, who will be providing us with an overview of Nature Action 100.
Well, thank you very much, Carolyn. And if we move to the next slide, um, yeah, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you all. So in recent years, we've seen awareness of nature-related financial risks grow significantly. And I think we're at an exciting time now where investors are demonstrating a strong appetite to comprehend and address these risks, both as they manifest on the level of individual assets or portfolio companies, but also at the portfolio level. And the flip side of risk is, of course, opportunity, and that opportunity exists to those companies and investors that can show leadership in a time at which regulatory and stakeholder expectations are advancing at pace. We now, of course, have an ambitious vision to halt biodiversity loss by 2030 per the Global Biodiversity Framework. So as a global engagement initiative, Nature Action 100 supports investors to address risks from nature loss at these investee companies and to grasp these opportunities. So how does it do this? Well, by coming together under a set of shared expectations, Nature Action 100 enables investors to strengthen their voice. We feel this is vital on issues of systemic importance such as this. It focuses effort on some of the most material areas, both from a financial and environmental materiality perspective. The Secretariat provides structure and support to engagements, including through joint learning sessions, but now also through providing invaluable data through the benchmark, which we're talking about today. And the benchmark will, of course, support investors to hone their engagement priorities and track corporate performance against their expectations. So moving on to the next slide. By way of context for Nature Action 100 through some very large numbers, a World Economic Forum and PwC study found that over half of the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. We, of course, depend on nature for all manner of ecosystem services, from the provisioning of essential resources to the regulating services that we often take for granted but couldn't function without. And I think if we reflect further, it's apparent that ultimately all economic activity is dependent on nature. Nature, the biosphere, is the context for all life, including our own, and human society is the context for the economy. So these are not competing spheres, but rather nested systems. To realize our societal goals as per the biodiversity framework, we will need to redirect financial flows away from economic activities that negatively impact nature and or transform those activities. So in terms of the scale of that issue, UNEP estimated such private sector financial flows to be 5 trillion in 2022. The final large figure on the screen is the biodiversity finance gap, and that corresponds to two elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework, specifically targets 18 and 19. These are the need to remove or reform $500 billion per year in harmful subsidies and incentives, and to scale up $200 billion per year in mobilizing new finance for nature. So where does Nature Action 100 fit into this? Well, it aims to raise private sector capacity to assess and disclose impacts and risks, and then encourage ambition and action to address those, all of which can support investors and corporates to either shift those financial flows or dramatically reduce the impact of the funded activities. So moving on. Nature Action 100 now counts over 230 institutional investors among its engagement teams, engaging with 100 companies, hence the name, selected from 8 high-impact sectors. And a common thread between these investors are the investor expectations published last year. So if we move on, you can see these expectations, and they serve as the foundation for all investor asks under Nature Action 100. And we're showing summarized versions on the screen here, but you can find them in full on our website. But in short, investors expect companies to have a strategic and comprehensive ambition to address their key drivers of nature loss. but also then, of course, to assess their nature-related impacts and dependencies and the risks and opportunities that arise from those. Then to set targets, relevant targets that are grounded in the assessments and that cover material impacts. To disclose, develop a plan of action to achieve those targets and put in place appropriate governance structures to oversee the achievement of the targets. And then finally, recognizing that companies don't exist in a vacuum, to engage with their value chains and other stakeholders, including policymakers, to address nature loss. So this is the framework around which the benchmark is structured. So these 6 expectations serve as the 6 core indicators in the benchmark, and these are in turn fleshed out across 50 metrics that are the assessable unit in the benchmark. So if we move on, we'll talk about developing how we develop the company benchmark. So although the nature space is often considered quite nascent, the past few years have yielded the publication of significant resources and guidance from the TNFD, SBTN, and others. And this is really helping companies and investors to define and grasp the nature problem. With the Nature Action 100 company benchmark, we have sought to marry the investor expectations on the previous slide with this pre-existing guidance and criteria where possible. And we make it clear where alignment lies in a supporting resource to the benchmark that's called the benchmark overview. So in addition to this review of the literature that we undertook, we also consulted with a broad range of stakeholders and rights holders, including nature-focused organizations and representatives of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and of course, Nature Action 100 investor participants themselves. And their input has really helped to strengthen the benchmark. So through this process of development, we were looking to keep the benchmark crisp and concise, but also to capture the information that investors need to comprehensively assess their company's disclosure on nature. And in order to score the benchmark, we of course had to develop assessment criteria against each metric, which set a high but achievable bar and try and ensure the objectivity and robustness of scoring. And we tested the practicality of the benchmark in a pilot round of testing and continued to refine the assessment criteria with our data provider for the benchmark, which is ICF, throughout that process of data gathering and of course, undertaking the benchmark assessments themselves. So if we move on to the next slide. The Nature Action 100 company benchmark is ready to be a useful resource for both investors and companies. For companies, it provides a useful guide in terms of how companies can meet investor expectations as you or they identify nature-related risks and articulate those plans to address them. And then for investors, of course, the data in the benchmark will, of course, support specific engagements with NA100 companies, but it will also help investors to think about and manage risks and opportunities at that portfolio level, which in turn makes a useful contribution to the achievement of the Global Biodiversity Framework's 2030 targets. I'll call out here target 14, which is about integrating biodiversity-related data into decision-making. Now I'm delighted to pass over to Graham Hamley, who really masterminded much of this work, and Graham will give an overview of the key findings from the first benchmark. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much, Sam. Next slide, please. And one more. Great. Thank you. All right, thanks a lot, Sam. So it's a pleasure to have you all here today, and I'm excited to run through some of the key findings from the first round of the benchmark with you all. As Sam mentioned a few minutes ago, the benchmark structured around 6 investor expectations for companies, which essentially serve as the 6 core benchmark indicators. So over the course of the next few slides, I'll share some key findings for each of these 6 indicators in turn, and then I will wrap up with some key takeaways. So first off, as you see on this slide here, we have the ambition indicator, and this looks at whether companies have essentially made nature-related commitments. So a company's public commitment to nature essentially serves as a signal to investors that the company is orienting its entity-wide strategic direction around nature and addressing its nature-related risks and opportunities. To this end, investors expect companies to commit to minimize contributions to key drivers of nature loss and to conserve and restore ecosystems both at the operational level and throughout their value chain by 2030. As you can see here, our data shows that just over 2/3 of the benchmarked companies, that's 69 companies, disclose a nature commitment. And of those, a further 2/3 or 45 disclose a commitment that's inclusive of their value chain. Next slide, please. Second, we have the assessment indicator. So assessments are really the essential building blocks on which companies can develop strategic plans and make capital allocation decisions that address their most material nature-related risks and opportunities. So companies that properly assess and disclose their nature-related issues will then be better prepared to identify and address risks, meet the requirements of advancing regulation, and also leverage opportunities. And this is reflected under Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which calls on businesses to regularly monitor, assess, and transparently disclose their risks, dependencies, and impacts on biodiversity. And legislation such as the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or EU CSRD, is also beginning to mandate nature and biodiversity disclosures. So amongst other things, the benchmark looks at whether companies are assessing whether they have any assets and or activities that are located in or near ecologically sensitive locations. And the results show that while some companies are disclosing this information for their direct operations, only one company discloses information about its upstream value chain, and none yet disclose information about their downstream value chain. The benchmark also looks at whether companies are assessing and disclosing their material nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, including the process used to assess these. And here the results show that only one company meets the disclosure threshold in this regard. Specifically, the metals and mining company Vale discloses its nature-related impacts in its direct operations. However, no companies yet meet the threshold for disclosure of their nature-related dependencies, risks, or opportunities. Next slide, please. Third, we have the targets indicator. So targets help companies focus their actions on addressing their most material nature-related impacts and dependencies, and also help to deliver on their strategic commitments. And we can see here that nearly half of the Nature Action 100 companies disclose nature-related targets. Digging into this a little deeper, company disclosures also suggest that companies are prioritizing activities to avoid and reduce nature loss, with a smaller subset also disclosing targets to restore and regenerate nature. So we're pleased to see that this prioritization of actions at this stage is aligned with the mitigation hierarchy, although ultimately investors expect to see all companies setting targets to avoid and reduce nature loss and also to restore and regenerate ecosystems. And progress in both of these areas is also critical for achieving Target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which calls for the mobilization of $200 billion annually in public and private investments to reduce impacts and restore and regenerate nature. The data also shows that no companies disclose evidence that their targets stem from assessments of their material nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. So this is one key area for improvement here. Essentially, by basing their targets on their nature-related materiality assessments, companies can ensure that they're addressing their most pressing nature-related issues to optimize the long-term sustainability of their business model. And as we know, there's also now a variety of tools and guides out there that have been developed by a range of organizations, including the TNFD and SBTN, to support companies through the process of setting and meeting meaningful targets. Finally, last piece on targets. So since the climate and nature crises are deeply interconnected, to meet global climate goals, companies must also be working to prevent and reverse nature loss. And likewise, to effectively address nature loss, companies need to take action to curb climate change. And on this point, we see that 15 of the 100 companies disclose an explanation of how their nature and climate targets are connected, therefore demonstrating that they understand this critical link and are working to make their current and future investments more sustainable. Next slide, please. On implementation, the benchmark assesses whether companies are disclosing a clear strategy that outlines how they intend to achieve their targets. And as you can see here, over a third of companies, that's 37 companies, have disclosed such strategies, which is overall quite positive. Unfortunately, only 14 companies disclose robust commitments to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and only about a third of those companies, that's 5 companies, apply the principle of free, prior, and informed consent when engaging with such communities on activities that could impact their rights. It's also worth noting here that none of the companies assessed meet all 4 of these metrics here relating to Indigenous peoples and local communities. Next slide, please. So the 5th indicator is about governance. And a key element of this expectation is that there should be clear board oversight over nature-related issues, and the board should also have appropriate nature-related expertise to manage these issues effectively. So 40 companies disclose that their board has oversight over how nature-related issues are managed. However, while this is a promising start, the data also suggests that additional oversight is needed to mitigate and address potential human rights risks, as only 11 companies disclose that they have board oversight of impacts on and engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities. And interestingly, 7 of these companies are from the metals and mining sector, and this likely reflects the higher level of scrutiny that metals and mining companies face, given the large overlap between mining operations and Indigenous peoples' lands. In addition, given the complexity of addressing nature loss and risks, it's also important that board members can demonstrate that they have sufficient expertise to adequately manage nature-related issues. And on this point, only 6 companies disclose evidence of board expertise on nature, and only 2 disclose sufficient expertise to oversee the company's impacts on and engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities. And just 1 company discloses evidence of expertise in both of these areas. Next slide, please. Finally, on the engagement indicator, the expectation is that companies should engage with their value chain and other stakeholders, that includes trade associations, industry groups, and policymakers, to create the enabling environment that's needed to achieve their nature targets. On this point, the data shows that companies' nature-related engagement efforts currently concentrate on their upstream value chain, with 39 companies disclosing that they set nature-related criteria for their tier 1 suppliers. That being said, only 12 companies disclose that they provide financial and or technical support to their suppliers to help them achieve the kinds of change that the companies want to see. And in comparison, no companies disclose commitments to conduct or advocate for lobbying activities that align with the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. So with that, that covers really the key findings across each of the 6 indicators. And I'd now just like to wrap up with a few high-level takeaways and some of the things that we consider to be most pressing and most pressing here. So at a high level, the results show that most companies are still in the early stages of addressing their nature-related issues, and that more urgent and ambitious action is needed. And at a more granular level, our 4 key takeaways are: first, the majority of companies disclose a nature-related ambition. Specifically, over 2/3 of companies disclose a commitment to protect nature, and of those companies, a further 2/3 have commitments that extend through their value chain. Second, only 1 company discloses evidence of a robust nature-related assessment. Specifically, Valley discloses evidence of a comprehensive assessment of its material nature-related impacts and standard operations, and none yet meet the threshold for assessment on and disclosure of material nature-related dependencies, risks, or opportunities, though our research shows that a few others have made early-stage progress in this regard. Third, a significant number of companies disclose nature targets and plans to implement them. Specifically, 47 companies disclose targets to avoid or reduce their impacts on nature, and over 3/4 of these companies also disclose strategies for achieving those targets. And fourth, companies disclose limited progress towards recognizing and protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Specifically, only 29 companies meet at least one of the 5 benchmark metrics related to respecting and upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, who, as we know, play a crucial role in biodiversity conservation, restoration, and stewardship. So with that, the final point I'd like to leave you with is a positive one. And I think that So namely, though we are seeing a lot of gaps and shortcomings at present, the nature landscape is evolving rapidly. There are a lot of great resources out there to help guide companies in the right direction. And this means that there's a lot of opportunity for companies to make quick progress in this space and to achieve the best practices set out in the benchmark as they begin to assess their interface with nature and use these findings and assessments to inform their actions going forward. So with that, I will stop there and pass back to you, Carolyn.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Graham. And also thank you to Sam for providing both an overview of the Nature Action 100 and the results from the key findings. So I'd like to invite Mary Beth and Peter to join me, and we're going to discuss the findings and how investors will make use of these results. And Rachel, could you advance us to the next slide, please? Oh, actually, you know what? Could you please take down the slides and we'll have Peter and Mary Beth. Thank you. So Mary Beth Gallagher is the Director of Engagement at Domini Impact Investments. And Mary Beth is responsible for leading Domini's engagement efforts with portfolio companies, broader stakeholder groups, and policymakers, oversees the firm's proxy voting, as well as developing initiatives and campaigns in areas such as human rights, climate change mitigation, biodiversity, deforestation, health, and racial justice. Mary Beth represents Domini on the U.S. State Department Advisory Committee on Responsible Business Conduct, on the steering group for Nature Action 100, and the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation Advisory Board. And Peter van der Werf is head of active ownership at Robeco. He leads the corporate and sovereign engagement program in the active ownership team. With his engagement work, he has engaged sustainability leadership at more than 200 global companies to align their environmental and social strategy with Robeco's sustainability investing philosophy. As portfolio manager, SDG Engagement Equities, Peter contributes to impact investing in listed equities. He is a member of the Nature Action 100 steering group and an advisory member for the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation. Rachel, if you could also spotlight Peter and Mary Beth, that would be great. Excellent. Thank you. All right.
Thanks for having us, Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you for joining. So I'll start off with maybe a simple question to Mary Beth. Can you share why you're participating in Nature Action 100? What are some of the challenges that you've faced with engaging companies on nature, and why is Nature Action 100 an initiative that you want to be a part of for addressing some of those challenges?
Thanks so much, Carolyn, for your leadership, for the webinar, and the opportunity to join you today. Again, I'm Mary Beth. I'm the Director of Engagement at Domini. So at Domini, we have a commitment to integrating environmental and social factors across our investment process. And in my role as Director of Engagement, we really see stewardship as an important lever to help advance company action on key sustainability challenges that are material to those business operations. We have long been working on the issue of deforestation, seeing that as a systemic risk important for addressing the climate crisis, addressing the well-being of communities, Indigenous peoples' rights. And on those systemic challenges, we know we can't really make progress company by company or issue by issue, that we really need a systemic and holistic approach. And that's where Nature Action 100 as a tool and a community of investors that are also committed to action in addressing nature loss is really helpful for us, where we have a shared set of expectations. It's an emergent issue. So really having a framework for how we move forward together that's rigorous, that's informed by stakeholder consultation, that's grounded in science has been really helpful. We have a clear set of expectations that we're bringing to companies for how they're going to manage these issues that are really material to their business. And we're able to monitor progress over time through tools like the benchmark. So for us, participation and collaboration is really key for our stewardship activities. And this initiative is something we're really pleased to have seen come to the forefront as standards are being set, as policymakers are taking action, and really gives us a launching point now with data to evaluate how companies are disclosing their activities to move productively forward. So We hope it's about a value for companies also to see investors coming together coherently around these set of expectations and engaging together to for efficiency as well.
Thanks, Mary Beth. And then Peter, turning to you, now that we've seen the results of the inaugural company benchmark, do you find these results surprising, or were they within your expectations?
Yes, thank you, Carolyn. It was indeed really great to see the benchmark come out because this is obviously really a landmark moment to sort of have a baseline on where we see all of the companies in the Nature Action 100 program, and it really then also helps us as investors to prepare our engagement based on those findings. If I look sort of more holistically at sort of the overarching results, then I think on the one hand, we see that companies over the course of the last years have embraced biodiversity as a topic that they need to address, and nature being a material topic in the ambition section section of the benchmark. So I think that's really a very important finding. At the same time, and this is something we've been hearing over the past years in individual engagements already, which we did prior to launching Nature Action 100, is that companies still really struggle to then continue to bring that into ultimately fully managing it, setting targets, and having programs along this. So from that perspective, I think it gives a very clear signal where in sort of the maturity of this topic and how companies are ultimately able to address it, we are. And that to a certain degree, still lays out a long road ahead of us to collectively with the investors and the companies work to achieving full marks on the benchmark, hopefully in a few years down the line for a few of the companies.
Yeah, thanks. I think just to highlight a point that you've made, it is the first benchmark. So we're taking a look to see where companies are today. And then through the engagement that Mary Beth talked about, there is opportunity for companies to make progress on this in the coming years. And then a question for you both. Graham just kind of went through some key findings, and I know you've had a chance to look through both the key findings report and maybe examine some of the actual company results themselves. And by the way, to our audience members, the full data set is available on their website, as well as many of the graphs that Graham shared with you today, as well as individual company assessments for each of the companies. And we'll make sure to drop links into the chat for you all on this. But a question that I want to ask to you both, based on the findings, what is a key theme that you might be prioritizing for engagement in the upcoming cycle under Nature Action 100? Maybe Mary Beth, I'll start with you.
Yeah, great, Carolyn. I think it's helpful to take stock overall of where companies are and then dig in a little bit more to the details of the company's teams that we're on. So for example, I'm on 5 company engagement teams, and we've been really parsing through. On the investor portal, you can see like a deep dive that goes metric by metric on how companies are doing against the indicators and sub-indicators. So it's really gives us an opportunity to build off the initial research we've done for our first set of engagements, to think about what are companies disclosing, how does this align with like this rigorous standard, this set of expectations that we have, because I think we all want to acknowledge that we're not starting from scratch on this issue. A lot of companies have done work that's responsive to different stakeholder needs over the years on supply chains that are at high risk of contributing to land use change or pollution. So we know we're not starting from scratch, but the framework gives us a helpful guide. And for us, something that really stands out is that only 13 companies met the criteria on assessment, that they were taking action, but it hadn't necessarily been grounded in an evaluation of their operational and supply chain impacts at a local basis. We know nature is local impacts on air and water and land and communities. And so that assessment really needs to be the grounding for any good strategy on nature moving forward. So when you see that 47 companies have set targets and only 13 have done an assessment, and even further that no companies show that their targets have been set based on the assessment, That is an area that raises questions for us, like how did you set your targets? Why were these the targets that you set? Are you planning to do an assessment? How will you prioritize the areas of your operations for either using the TNFD LEAP approach or another rigorous scientific tool? We know data is a big challenge on nature-related risks and impacts and dependencies. And so I think encouraging companies to work with the data they have, as imperfect or incomplete as it may be, to do those assessments and then make strategic decisions. So I think for our teams, really leaning in on assessment would be something that Domini is looking at.
Thanks, Mary Beth. How about you, Peter? What are your focus areas?
Yeah, so with Robeco, we always take a very fundamental investment-focused approach from a research perspective, both on investments and on sustainability. So we had done a lot of work within our team already when we started, when we were assigned to the companies that we lead on. And I think the benchmark results really are a confirmation of a lot of the research that we had put in when we established the relationships with the companies. I think it's always very helpful to have this, to be able to share this type of research and sort of help companies to sort of give them a bit of a mirror on where they see themselves and where we see them as investors, and then take that as a starting point for the conversation. What I think is a bit of a challenge across the whole range is that you have some companies that are very well versed and accustomed to engaging on a host of different sustainability topics with investors in a collaborative setting. But we have a few of them that we've picked up for our leadership that are really very new to this program. So they still need to actually get on board with the engagement in a collaborative fashion. So I think we're investing still heavily in building those engagement relationships. And again, there the benchmark is a very helpful tool to introduce the program and also show that we have something to bring into that relationship.
Yeah, and I think actually that leads to maybe the next question that I was going to ask. But I was curious about how the information does facilitate your engagements in the next steps. And you sort of touched on these elements, Peter, but is there anything that you would add to what you were just saying about that?
Yeah, so it's important to know that this is really very much a company by company engagement strategy that each group is running, and each company has its unique set of challenges, but also in some cases a sense of maturity in terms of how they deal with it. So with some companies, you might hear that they've gone through their own process and they might not agree with all of our findings from the investment or from the benchmark research, and that's a good starting point. For others, it's very much still bringing this concept to life, as I explained before. So I think that is a very important point to note. And I think the strength also lies in really representing the collective voice of a larger group of investors, which then sort of defines a common set of expectations, as Mary Beth also explained before, which is really helpful for most companies, given that this is often, particularly in the nature and biodiversity space, something they struggle with. Like what is it across a whole range of issues, topics, or indicators that I should be looking at a company, and please help me guide us in the right direction, what we should report or what we should steer on. So I think the benchmark is a crucial instrument there.
Yeah, definitely agree. And there's lots of different elements in the benchmark. And so kind of being able to figure out where to focus maybe from the start could be really helpful. How about for you, Mary Beth? With this data out, how is it going to facilitate your engagements?
Yeah, I think it really helps us to dig into what a company is currently disclosing. I think some companies will talk about work that they have underway that they haven't yet made public, and this is an incentive for them to give investors the tools they need to really evaluate their progress and activities. I think an overarching feeling that is validated by the benchmark is that companies have approached nature in a bit of an ad hoc way, and that the benchmark offers like this holistic kind of systemic approach. So we've kind of broken down those expectations into two phases. The first is really like organizing your nature strategy. So that's things like the assessment, which I've just mentioned, really setting a commitment to what your overall nature approach will be. And of course, having buy-in from the board. So thinking about this in terms of like that set of indicators as a starting point for most companies feels intuitive in terms of like setting a good strategy in place. And then you can move to the second phase, which is the targets around implementation, target setting, and expectations, or implementation, and engagement with suppliers and stakeholders. So that is really like where the work gets done. And I think another observation we have, something that Graham shared, was really around an overarching finding, which I think is something that each engagement group can likely find a way to bring into their activities, is the grounding in a rights-based approach for the implementation. So the takeaway that only a handful, like 14 or 16 companies, had looked at a commitment to respect Indigenous people's rights. Only 5 had committed to respect free, prior, and informed consent, when we know many companies' activities, whether it's in mining or food and beverage, have localized impacts that touch on the rights or land or cultural traditions of Indigenous peoples. We, I think, as a community of investors, have an opportunity to bring this expectation forward and show that there's a lot of collective room for improvement across sectors, where peer-to-peer learning may be an opportunity for companies. But now we know the data, at least, to see, okay, how many companies lack this policy commitment, and then how do we communicate how that's relevant to their nature strategy overall?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's, I think it's quite interesting, the thing that you've highlighted, which is that potentially a lot of companies have been taking action on nature. It's quite piecemeal, but to think about it holistically and how all of these different actions are going to contribute to these companies being able to address either their impacts or the dependencies or overall nature loss is the through line of trying to understand the overarching strategy and how companies are approaching this. So yeah, thanks for emphasizing that. And you kind of touched on this as well, Mary Beth, but the results do signify that there's room for improvement, and there's opportunity for companies to strengthen their approach. So when it comes to engagement, what advice can you offer to companies as they're reviewing their assessments? Or perhaps when you walk into an engagement, how are you talking with companies about these results?
Oh, I can get started, then turn to you, Peter. I think starting with humility, like maybe there's something we missed, like recognizing like this was a rigorous, thorough approach, but questions around methodology or data availability, like that's always part of a conversation. Did we miss anything here? So that, I think, is just how we have to approach it, because a company knows their own business and activities and disclosures best. That being said, I think once that's done, it's really a tool, hopefully, for those individuals within companies who see the importance of nature to their business as a risk and opportunity, to take it internally and think about, do we have the right resources, the expertise, the personnel, the data, the tools, the consultants, the advising services to really bring this strategy to life. I think it also offers good insight into peer comparison. So you can click into the assessment of your peer group and see who's excelling, look at their disclosures and how you might learn from them or lean into them. I think our hope is that this is, like Peter just mentioned, something that we're bringing to the table that can help companies that are like struggling to prioritize climate versus nature versus human capital management among different issues. Like, where does this fit and how do we integrate our climate and nature strategy? For example, I think this is a tool that really can help companies do that. But I think we're really poised to act. So for us, we are using this as a natural moment to re-engage with the companies, to start a conversation about their insights or that they've been able to take from the benchmark, and then set our priorities for the engagement teams.
Yeah, thank you. And Peter, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I would fully agree with Mary Beth in terms of how to use that. I think it is really a learning opportunity for companies. It's something that we bring as an investor community. We help them to shape those expectations, and it also outlines indeed where we see a bit of a transition path in terms of their practices and what we ultimately would want them to achieve. Primarily also because achieving the global biodiversity framework will be key to investors to address the long-term systemic risk of biodiversity loss. And so I think giving companies that reflection and then actually the helpful tools of this is how we break down your performance, this is what we measure and what we would want to see from you in the future is something that I think any head of sustainability can take on board as they think about their planning for next year and the years after, how to address their impact.
Yeah, and then maybe as a final question, before we go to audience Q&A. So that was kind of good food for thought for companies who are maybe thinking, okay, the benchmark results are out, what do I do? We also know that there are a lot of investors who are sort of at the beginning stages of integrating nature consideration into their strategies. What would you say to those investors about how they can utilize Nature Action 100 and its tools, like the benchmark, to support the companies that are within their portfolio? Peter, do you have any thoughts on that one or recommendations?
For investors, I think joining in this program is really helpful. Because it gives you such a good learning space to also work with others that have already a longer track record on working on this topic. So for those that are really new, I think this really provides a lot of helpful tools with this webinar, but many of the others in terms of the educational material that the corporate engagement working group can provide. The research is very helpful, obviously, in terms of thinking about how to integrate this, and then ultimately, and that's a process that we're going through now, given that we have pledged this with the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation when we joined that effort 4 years ago, is to then also really develop nature targets, and we're integrating that as part of our net zero and nature roadmap that we will be launching soon. And I think this is also something where, again, investors can learn from those that have already gone through that process initially. So also here, there's great opportunities to collaborate and learn amongst each others from peers.
Yeah, agree. It's a great reason to be part of Nature Action 100. Mary Beth, anything to add, or do you feel like Peter summarized that?
No, I think he did a really good job there. I guess one thing I'd underline is there's a lot of that's been developed over the last several years, science-based targets for nature, TNFDs, the PRI Spring Initiative, and that there's a lot of harmonization between those efforts. There's a lot of consistency in terms of what we're asking for. So if you've taken one path so far, you're welcome in Nature Action 100. I think there's a lot of resonance with all of the shared expectations around whether it's disclosure, action, or initiatives that are underway. So there's resources out there. I think a lot of peer-to-peer learning is part of this. And we'll hopefully be able to move forward really proactively together.
Yeah, I hope to see that as well. Okay, let's see. Right on time. So as I mentioned, we do want, there have been some questions that have come through in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And so we can do a question and answer session now. I'd like to invite Graham to join us on screen. So Rachel, if you could spotlight Graham as well. Thank you. Okay, so I've got a handful of questions from our audience. I'll just kind of send a few your way. So maybe starting with some pieces for you, Graham. There are questions from folks about the process for developing the benchmark. So who were the industry experts that were consulted? And then also, can you speak more to how we engaged with representatives of Indigenous people and local communities to seek their feedback?
Sure, yeah, happy to. Great questions. So first off, I'm excited to say that we have included a list of the experts consulted in the methodology document, which is available on the website, or those that were comfortable to be listed there. So by all means, feel free to take a look at that. Just to give a flavor of who we engaged with throughout this process. I think as Sam mentioned earlier on, we spoke with a range of different actors. We spoke with Nature Action 100 investor participants themselves and a range of NGOs and CSOs. And in that space, we really wanted to make sure we were speaking to sort of some of the other entities have made a lot of great progress in this space, and so we had some good conversations with, for example, just to list a few, but by no means exclusive, the TNFD, SBTN, World Benchmarking Alliance, World Economic Forum, CDP, and Business for Nature. And so the nature of these interactions spanned from interviews, group convenings, and sort of discussion sessions through to review of draft methodologies and iteration on these methodologies. And this really also speaks to our process with engaging with experts on and representatives of Indigenous peoples and local communities as well. So in that space, we certainly obviously consulted a spectrum of key resources out there. Amongst other things, we looked at the TNFD guidance on engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities and affected stakeholders, and various resources by the accountability framework. But we also sort of engaged in extended and very, very productive and very helpful conversations with these actors. And as I say, a really key piece of this was being able to have a conversation over time where we are able to share draft with methodology, get input on that, and iterate going forward. And the final point I'll mention here is a key piece of this was that we wanted to make sure that we were not just capturing the presence or absence of corporate policies pertaining to different aspects of managing impacts on engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities. We also wanted to try and understand whether these policies are being applied in practice as well. So this is really something that we've tried to build into the final benchmark methodology.
Thanks, Graham. And we mentioned that we worked with a data provider for the assessments. Who was that?
We worked with ICF, the consulting company ICF. So yeah, we've had a very productive relationship with them, and they've been a great partner in this project from the beginning.
So we do have a question from the audience. We were expecting this. So the results of the election were announced yesterday morning in the US. Question to Mary Beth or Peter. What does this mean for Nature Action 100 and how engagements might move forward? Any thoughts? It's very early still.
Sure. Yeah. No, thanks for that question, Carolyn, and happy to take that. I think when we as an investor look at some of these systemic risks, both on climate and on nature, I think there is a lot of collective action that is needed. Where I think there is individual expectations for companies, as we've laid them out with Nature Action 100, and then there's obviously elements in the global biodiversity framework, but also in the Paris Accord that obviously shape those expectations. I think the U.S. elections probably give some room for thought in terms of how that playing field will develop in the coming years, particularly also with some of the commitments from the Republican side in terms of how they think about priorities between nature, climate, but then also economic opportunities with sort of the current activities. And I think that is a space where companies will need to navigate themselves between probably a larger gap of what is expected in a transition versus what the regulatory environment is able to support in that process. And I think that, from my perspective, even increases further the need for engagement by investors to help them provide that mandate to actually move in that transition to where we would want them to be. So I hope that they take the benchmark results and ultimately also the expectations towards 2030 and achieving the global biodiversity framework as a very helpful tool to shape that trajectory, while at the same time, navigating that political environment.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And Mary Beth, I have a question for you. Because you talked about engaging with companies and having dialogue with them, trying to understand what their constraints might be as to why they may or may not have made progress on something. And we have a question from an audience member that's curious about how you feel about being able to have kind of a critical conversation to really meaningfully understand what's happening at the company level. How do you feel about being able to do that through your engagements?
Yeah, I think that's like what engagement is really about. Like what's your plan? How are you going to manage this? Why aren't you managing it in the way that aligns with our expectations? I think we're really coming to this with an open mind rather than like a formulaic kind of prescriptive approach. We recognize companies are at different stages of their journey. They're facing different regulatory and consumer pressures that we need to be able to respond to. Um, and there was another question about allocation of capital. So like understanding where this fits in terms of like target setting. One of the things we want to be able to understand is why is this challenging and what can we do to create an ecosystem that enables that positive action, whether it's like supporting policy action, supporting companies and how they collaborate, or like the world of the data providers and what data and insights are available. We need to understand why this is hard so we can move forward productively. So I think really just to emphasize this as a starting point for action. I think there was another question about disinvestment. I think from all of us, our firms have our own approach to how we evaluate company progress and what our expectations are. I don't think this is at all at this point in time like a list of companies that are the worst actors or lagging peers. It's really an evaluation based on a set of criteria. So it wouldn't necessarily be a signal to prompt any action. But what we want to see and hope to see over time is progress improve and really companies take this starting point and move forward productively. And some of the indicators do get to things like capital allocation that are part of implementation and really bringing a fruitful nature strategy to life. We know that there will need to be resourcing and new oversight of supplier relationships or considerations around pollution controls. So there will need to be investment, and hopefully companies will become more comfortable with disclosing that information, as has happened with the climate transition planning.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. And thank you for also answering the question about your thoughts on disinvestment. I know that that's quite specific too, depending on how each individual investor decides to make decisions. And maybe, because you did mention the allocation thing, and we have a question from an audience member. So Graham, I might ask you, I think the way that we've been talking about the benchmark results today, it sounds like we're talking about ambition, targets, metrics, et cetera. But what about where companies are allocating funding? How does that show up? Or capital allocation, for example, how does that show up in the benchmark? Can you maybe speak to that metric?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So to contextualize that very briefly, I mean, obviously we have, as we've talked about, we have indicators looking at targets. We then step on to look at whether the companies are demonstrating strategies to achieve that targets and setting out strategies to achieve those targets. And a key piece of this is, in addition to having set out a clear roadmap to achieve these targets, is that our companies also disclosing that they are allocating their resources to support this outcome as well. So this is captured specifically in the fourth indicator on implementation, specifically, I believe, sub-indicator 4.3. So yeah, this really looks at whether companies are disclosing that they have to date been allocating resources towards achievement of these targets, and any forward-looking plans in that regard too.
Great. Thank you so much, Graham. So we're coming up to 2 minutes to the top of the hour. I want to thank Graham, Sam, for giving an overview of both Nature Action 100 and the benchmark results. Thank you to Peter and Mary Beth for joining us today, sharing your investor perspective and insights on how to make use of the benchmark, how you approach engagement, and then also sharing your thoughts for other investors who might be at an early stage of their engagement process. So I do want to cover a couple of logistical things. This session is being recorded, and we will be sharing the recording with everyone who registered for the webinar, so including those who weren't able to join this session now today. And there are a number of resources that are available on our website. We don't have the chat function open, but Graham very helpfully has dropped in some links in response to a few of the questions that came up from some of the participants here today. So you should be able to access that link. And so on our website, and let me try and do this really quickly, all of the results of the company benchmark are found on our website, and there's a page, there's a tab that says company benchmark in our top corner. So all of the results can be found there. There's a report that covers the key findings And that goes into more detail and shares more detail about what Graham covered for you today. And then there are 2 data sets that you can access. Oh, thanks, Graham. You're able to drop links in the chat. I appreciate that. So there are 2 data sets that you can access. One is just a bunch of data on how companies are doing on all of the metrics, the indicators, sub-indicators, and metrics, and you can kind of shift through those. And then there's also a way to view the individual company assessments themselves. So if you want to look at how one NA100, Nature Action 100 company scored on all of the metrics, you can view that on the individual company assessment page. And then finally, a few of you have asked, do we have a full data set that covers all of the data for everything? So you could just download that. And we do have that as well. It was in the resource section of our website. Graham will also drop a link in the chat for that piece. And so with that, thank you all so much for joining us today. Appreciate all of the questions, and I apologize that we haven't been able to get to all of them. Thank you again to Graham, Sam, Peter, and Mary Beth. Have a good one. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye.